This is Cornstalks and Sports Talk, your go-to Iowa-based sports show, hosted by the one and only Eliot Clough.
All that's left of the FCS season is the title game in Frisco, Texas, coming up on January 8th between number 3 NDSU and number 1 South Dakota State, North Dakota State, of course, so I'm talking about. Just one game, but so many other things to discuss here with Sam Herder of Hero Sports FCS on Cornstalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com this morning. Sam, we appreciate you hopping on, but first things first, an all-MVFC final happening in the FCS, the first time since it was NDSU and Illinois State in 2014?
Yep.
Okay, I was going to say, you're the man to know that. Did you see this one coming with the way the seedings were and everything, how it was put together by the committee?
Yeah, I did. When the bracket was first announced, I came out with my national title favorites ranked 24-1, and I had South Dakota State number 1, North Dakota State number 2. And so I felt this was going to be the matchup. Now, heading into last weekend, I did predict Montana State to win. So I kind of flip-flopped there a little bit just because I thought Montana State was rolling. But as far as this being the matchup, I thought just with how the bracket shook out, when you saw, okay, NDSU, maybe they would have to go on the road to play Sac State, but that didn't end up happening. I think just how the bracket looked back in late November, I think a lot of people saw this as, okay, we finally might see this North Dakota State, South Dakota State rivalry game down there in Texas.
Now, with that said, having two teams in the same conference facing off in the title game, is this good for the FCS?
Yes and no. I think it's good for the FCS in terms of the amount of attention it's going to get in the crowd that's going to be down there in Frisco and the atmosphere. I think all that is going to lead to, kind of the people that view the FCS and kind of watch this game and see the crowd there and see how much raw talent is on that field. There's a lot of next level guys on that field. I think that part of it is good for the FCS in terms of people just think, wow, this is big time football right here. This is a blast of a game compared to, not to pick on any other teams, but if it was Sac State versus William and Mary, I mean, there might be 10,000 people there. Like, that's just kind of the reality of things. And so I think from that aspect of it, it is good. The aspect of it where it'd be bad is just, the powers of the FCS, as everyone knows, has kind of shifted to the Midwest, the Montana schools, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, just with they have the most engaged fan bases. They're taking football the most seriously. Teams from the Big Sky and the Valley, are, as far as the resources they're putting into football compared to, the CAA and the SoCon, the Big South, all their teams that used to put a lot of resources in the football. Well, they're now in the FBS. And so I think that would be the negative part is, I think the FCS just as a whole needs more, teams across the FCS landscape that can truly compete for a national title. Because at some point, if it's the Big Sky versus the Valley or the Valley versus the Valley every year, at what point does the SoCon fans just stop caring about the FCS national title picture? And that part of it wouldn't be good for the FCS.
Right. And the FCS is already kind of suffering in terms of, is suffering in terms of attendance and fan base engagement. So that's tough. And with just the sheer dominance of North Dakota State, it's tough to see another team really sort of usurping them unless it's a South Dakota State or NDSU moves on to the FBS, which, speaking of that, as a guy that covers UNI, obviously I see a lot of UNI Twitter. Before we move on, talking a little bit more about that title game here on Cornstalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com with Sam Herder from Hero Sports FCS. Why hasn't North Dakota State moved on to the FBS? I know there are so many different things, and I'm sure you've heard this conversation so many times. If there's anybody, again, to tell us about why this hasn't happened yet, I know some UNI fans and fans across the Valley and the FCS are just kind of getting tired of how dominant North Dakota State has been. Now, they weren't so much that way this year, but with that said, why haven't they moved to the FBS yet?
Yeah, I mean, you can basically sum it up as location, lack of invites, and then also money as well. I mean, if NDSU was located in Virginia or in Missouri, they'd be in the Sun Belt by now. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind they'd be in the Sun Belt. But when you look at where NDSU is located, there's not really a geographical fit. It's going to be hard to convince FBS group of 5 presidents to add North Dakota State to their conference when you look at that travel, because a lot of people will look at it from a football perspective, but you're not only from NDSU's perspective of traveling all the other sports to these other places, but it's also, these other conferences, these other teams in these conferences saying, well, do we really want to add Fargo, North Dakota to our footprint and send our volleyball team and softball team, track and field teams, basketball teams there. And so I think location is really the main factor of it. And just there hasn't been, an invite for NDSU. Liberty was kind of the exception of they kind of just went FBS on their own and went independent, but that's because they had loads of money to do it. NDSU, you can go from a financial perspective of it too, where NDSU's student fees for athletics is, I don't even know, less than $100. I don't know how much it is, but it's very few amount compared to James Madison, where they were charging $1,000 per student. And so for NDSU to go FBS, I don't know where that money is going to come from, because if they try to increase the student fee, they tried that like 5 years ago to help with travel, that got voted down very easily. The money's not going to come from the state. It's not going to come from the university. And so for NDSU to go FBS, they would have to double their athletic budget. You're not going to get that all from a TV deal. And so I don't know where that money would come from. So it's just more so than money. It's just the location part of it. And at the end of the day, you can't just go FBS. I know the ASUN and WAC, they're trying to, but if you're NDSU, you can't just say, we would like to go FBS. We're going to go FBS. That's just not how it works. They need an invite first. And, so far that invite has yet to come.
And speaking of that location proximity, being in Big Ten country here in Iowa, I don't see that move coming up anytime soon, even though they beat Iowa however many years ago that was. But with this game coming up between NDSU and South Dakota State here January 8th in Frisco, who do you see winning this game? Is it SDSU again? Does NDSU get back to their championship ways and beat a rival here? How does it shake out?
Yeah, I think that you have to favor the Jacks right now, just with how they're playing. Even at full strength, I still think South Dakota State would be the favorite going into this game. But then you also have to factor in just the sheer amount of guys that NDSU doesn't have, whether it's All-American fullback Hunter Lipke, who's a pro prospect. Noah Gindorf is a pro prospect at tight end. They're also down 2 tight ends. Their number 2 running back, Tamarick Williams, we don't know if he'll be back yet. Kobe Johnson, their new number 1 running back, he left the game this last weekend with a finger injury. The defensive side of the ball, they lost Eli Mostart, their All-American. He's been out for a while. His twin brother, Will Mostart, he's another defensive tackle. He left the game. There's been some other defensive ends and defensive players that have gotten injured. They've had some key guys enter the transfer portal as well. And so you look at their 2 deep in August compared to what it is now, and it's just not even close to the same. And so I do think North Dakota State, the injuries will be a factor, but at the same time, I don't want South Dakota State fans to think we're setting up the narrative of, well, if NDSU loses, it's because they're injured. Like I said, even full strength, I still think the Jacks would be favored, but it should be a good game. NDSU knows how to utilize these 3 weeks. They know what it takes to win in Frisco. I think you see that when NDSU plays first-time opponents, whether it was Montana State or Jacksonville State a few years ago. NDSU just looked ready to go. Meanwhile, those other teams were kind of, they're kind of trying to get their feet under them on that bright national title stage. And by that time, it was too late. And so I think NDSU could potentially close that gap with their injuries, just that they have that experience of being there before. South Dakota State's been there too, but that was in the spring. Only a week, between games. And so the 3-week buildup is kind of a different element to this as well.
With all of that said, obviously we've talked about the implications of it being 2 MVFC teams, who we expect to win. Both of these teams very talented. The conversation across Valley fans, from what I've seen, it's not just the UNI fan base. I've seen it from obviously Youngstown State and some other schools that had some pretty decent seasons, but just 3 teams from Missouri Valley Football Conference in the playoff picture this season, and 5 from the CAA, who you mentioned a little bit ago, not putting the amount of resources into their football teams. Did you agree with the playoff picture, the way it was set up with so few MVFC teams when it came out, and has that changed at all since the way things have played out throughout the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, hindsight is what it is, just with how the CAA, for the most part, when they did exit this year's playoffs, it was in pretty ugly fashion. Especially William and Mary and some other teams as well with how they exited. Elon, they lost pretty ugly fashion. Delaware lost pretty ugly as well. Richmond pushed Sac State, and so I guess that was one that wasn't an ugly exit, but it was still a loss, and so a loss is a loss. So hindsight is what it is. The CAA probably got too many teams in. The Valley probably could have gotten one more team in, but at the same time, there was going to be that one team. It was probably going to be Youngstown State, and Youngstown fans can complain about not getting in, but if you don't lose to, I think it was Missouri State, who obviously didn't live up to expectations, had a losing record. If you don't lose that game, you're in at 8-3 instead of being left out at 7-4. And so I know we see this basically every year, honestly, in the FCS playoffs, where there's the narrative of this conference is better than that conference, and then something happens in a certain round, and then a fan of X conference says, "See, we told you so. We have more teams in the second round quarterfinals than your conference." But then the second round, the quarterfinals happen, and then those teams in that conference all lose, and then the other conference has all their teams winning, and then fans from that conference say, "Nope, see, told you we're better than your conference." And so I think maybe someone from the playoff committee, it may have been the chair that said they thought the CAA was the best conference in the FCS. I think maybe he had a quote that said that. I'm not sure. I might be wrong on that, but someone asked them about like the bubble, and they said we felt the CAA was one of the better conferences or something like that. But from my perspective, I haven't seen anyone that actually covers the FCS say that. I think everyone's been either Big Sky versus the Valley as far as who the best conference is. I haven't really heard anyone that covers the FCS say the CAA is the best conference. And so because of that, having 5 teams in versus 3 Valley teams in, you could say that, Youngstown should have gotten in over, like a Delaware or a team like that. So.
Now, in regards to UNI, do you think the Panthers had any argument to get into the playoffs this season at 6-5? No signature win, having that loss to Illinois State, loss to North Dakota State. Was there any argument there? I mean, that one loss towards the end of the season was 3 points to the number 1 team in the country. Do you think Coach Farley and company had an argument to get in this season?
They probably did, but probably not, a great one. The argument would be just how they pushed South Dakota State, the number 1 team in the FCS. That was probably the best argument. But when you had so many 7-4 teams in there, you also had UC Davis, who was, I believe, 6-5, and they pushed Sac State, really hard. They also beat Idaho, who was a playoff team. And then, Sac State beat Northern Iowa. And so if there was going to be a 6-5 team to make it in, it probably was going to be UC Davis instead of Northern Iowa. But then there was so many 7-4 teams in the field or on the bubble. There was also Florida A&M, who was 9-2. And so I kind of said all year that I just didn't feel like 6-5 was going to get you in just because of all the other 7-4 teams. And, I think if there was going to be a 4th Valley team in, it probably would have been Youngstown State at 7-4 over a 6-5 Northern Iowa team. And I just felt like with how the Valley performed in the non-conference, to get 5 teams in from the Valley just didn't seem realistic this year. And so, I didn't really have much thought of predicting Northern Iowa to get in just because, are they one of the best 24 teams in the playoffs or in the FCS, possibly, but at the same time, you have to take into account, the auto bids and stuff like that. And so, I never really felt that Northern Iowa was maybe had a slim chance, but never really a good chance to make the playoffs once they hit that 5th loss.
Now, with that, all that said, did you get to watch UNI at all this year?
Oh yeah, I probably watched, if not all their games, probably 8 to 9 of their games.
Sure. Okay. I know covering national stuff can be really hard to get to everything, but with that said, you do a great job. I don't know if you hear that very often, but I promise you do.
Thank you.
Yeah. But with that said, UNI was red hot towards the end of the season. When you get towards that part of the year, and you're playing at that high of a level, you have to look at body of work, right? You have to look at the entire body of work. And I'm assuming, would you say that eye test they're a top 24 team, because that's where I ended up. Is eye test, yes, they look like they're one of the best teams in the country, but then you look at entire body of work, they don't have that signature win. Even with the quarterback play of Theo Day, who was phenomenal this season, and the defense figuring things out, it just came too late.
Yeah, and that's what makes projecting the playoffs, the field and what it's going to look like, hard to do, because I believe each playoff committee member, they serve a 5-year term on the board, but they have two or three representatives leaving every year, and every year there's a new chair on the playoff committee, and so every year they kind of change what they value the most. And I know some years they did look at how you finish the season, and we want to get the best, X amount of teams into the field that are playing their best. I know, I can't remember what year it was, but people were asking, why was this team in? Why was this team not in? And they said, well, this team ended the year on a 4-game winning streak. This team lost their last 4 games. This might have been like 2019. Well, this year, you're right, Northern Iowa, how they were playing, probably one of the best 24 teams in the in the FCS. But again, it's more of who are the best 13 teams outside of the AQs, because again, we know Northern Iowa is better than Davidson, but Davidson gets the auto bid, and so it's not all about who are the best 24 teams in, is who are the best 13 outside of the 11 AQs. And Northern Iowa was rolling at the end there compared to Delaware, who lost, I think it was 3 of their final 4 games. But Delaware finished 7-4. They had the FBS win over Navy, and that was, again, they probably looked at body of work rather than, how you finish. And so, every year it just kind of changes. But I do think they did go eye test more this year more than anything. I heard the playoff committee chair say that, quite a bit, which again, it's hard to know what they're going to do, because sometimes they talk about resume, sometimes they talk about eye tests. And I know when it came to Sac State versus South Dakota State for the number 1 seed, the committee chair said, well, Sac State had the better resume, but our eye test told us that South Dakota State, we felt, was the better team. And then someone else asked, they were talking about, why was Montana in and not, Chattanooga or Youngstown State? And again, he said, well, you can kind of dive into resumes all you want, but as far as eye test, Montana nearly beat Sac State. They nearly beat Weber State. And our eye test told us that, Montana was, a better team than, say, Chattanooga. And so they did do eye tests this year, compared to more so maybe compared to other years.
That's interesting to hear, given what I just mentioned. But with all of that said, the talk of the playoffs, a lot of what people were saying in the Cedar Valley regarding UNI and why they missed the playoffs this season was because their strength of schedule was so crazy. I mean, you look at the MVFC, that's already a gauntlet, right? Already one of the best, if not the best conference in the entire country. And then you throw in a game against Air Force, which is so difficult to prepare for, and then a game against Sacramento State. What the thinking has been is just schedule a cupcake, get that 7th, get that 8th win, take care of business against Illinois State, take care of business against North Dakota, and you're in. And are you on board with that sentiment? Do you think it's fair? Do you think it's lunacy? Where are you with that?
Yeah, I tweeted this too, that the playoff committee sent the wrong message this year on how to schedule in the non-conference, because if you want to be a Patriot League team, the second place Patriot League team to get in, or if you're Florida A&M and you want to get into the playoffs, you need to schedule tougher in the non-conference, because when you play in a what is considered a weaker conference, you're going to have to show that you have beaten quality teams in the non-conference to show that you are deserving of getting into the playoffs. The Big Sky and the Valley, 2 conferences that are considered the best, there can be the mindset of, well, we don't need to schedule. Well, FBS is a different, thing because there's money involved, but there could be some mindset of, if we're from one of those conferences, why would we schedule a really, really good FCS non-conference game when we don't need to beat that team to prove how good we are? If we go 6-2 in our conference or 5-3 in our conference, that means we're going to be viewed pretty good because we playing one of the best conferences. And so why not just schedule 3 cupcakes, go 3-0? All we need to do is go 4-4 in conference play, and we'll be in at 7-4. I hate that, obviously, because I want to see good non-conference games. I mean, Montana State and South Dakota State are playing next year. That's phenomenal. But, if you're UC Davis and Northern Iowa are the prime examples, two probably of the better 25 teams in the FCS. Northern Iowa, they played Sac State, they played an FBS opponent. UC Davis played an FBS opponent, and they played at South Dakota State and nearly won. If UC Davis didn't play that game and they played, Lamar instead of South Dakota State, UC Davis is 7-4, and they're probably in the playoffs. And so you're and you look at Montana, they played Northwestern State, Indiana State, and South Dakota this year, and they went 3-0, which helped them get to 7-4 and into the playoffs. And that was a pretty bad non-conference schedule. Now, granted, South Dakota made the playoffs last year, and so that the game at the time we thought was okay. That's good non-conference. But just to repeat what I said, I just think that sends a wrong message of if you play in one of these top conferences, you don't need to go out and schedule tough because if your record is at least 7 D1 wins, you'll make it in. I think that's the wrong message because I love how Northern Iowa schedules. When they play Montana, Sac State, that's great for the FCS. And now all of a sudden, if you're sending the message of, well, if you do that, you're going to hurt your chances to make the playoffs, then that's not a message that I agree with.
It feels like the two playoff committees from the FBS and the FCS do that completely differently. Are you on? Do you agree with me there?
Yeah, probably. Again, with just what the FCS playoff committee, they kind of change, right, every year on what they value the most, and so
right.
Sometimes they do reward playing tough non-conference, and they take that into account. But there's other times too when I think they were asked about why did UC Davis not make it in, and they basically said, well, with 6 D1 wins, it's hard to put them in when we're looking at other bubble teams and they all have 7 or 8 D1 wins. And so that goes back to the point of, well, if UC Davis didn't play South Dakota State and they played a bad Southland team, well, do they make the playoffs then just because they didn't play a better or they played a worse non-conference opponent? So
right,
it's just kind of a tough message there.
I just want to be upset, Sam. Just let me be upset.
Yeah.
Again, we're talking with Sam Herder from Hero Sports FCS here on Corn Stalks and Sports Talk on AM 950 KOEL and KOEL.com this morning. We just talked with Keith Murphy of WHO 13, who's kind of the Iowa sports guy here, a couple of weeks ago regarding the craziness that is the transfer portal. Of course, we talked about that a little bit before we started recording, but we talked about the grand scheme of college football when I spoke with Keith, but overall, with I think it was over 1,000 players in the portal at one point in time, that's probably dropped significantly. Maybe not significantly, but that's dropped with some more commitments as of late. Is it good for the FCS?
I think there's positives and negatives to it. Obviously the negatives are, there's a lot of all conference, all American level guys that, especially this year, it seems like, half of Hero Sports' freshmen and sophomore all Americans are all in the transfer portal. And so that part of it has hurt the FCS, just losing top tier guys to the FBS, whether it is the Power 5 or Group of 5. And, I know that FCS coaches believe that the FBS programs, they all have, as far as their recruiting coordinators or whatever, like they're paying attention to, who the top FCS players are. And it's always funny when when I'm doing my preseason All-American teams or, top 25 FCS quarterbacks, top 25 FCS linebackers. Last summer when I was doing that, I got like 5 new followers from the FBS, director of personnel. And it's like, I wonder what you're following me for. Checking out who the top FCS players are. Like, I don't know why else, XG5 group of, director of personnel would be following me. So that's the negative part of it. The positive part of it is the FCS now has never brought in better high school talent. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. One is just the level of coverage that the FCS gets, playing more on ESPN. I think more people are paying attention to the FCS. And so I think, high school guys realize they don't need to go to the FBS to, they can go to the FCS and still play pro ball. And I think that awareness has set in where the FCS is getting more and more 3-star guys, even some 4-star guys. But I also think that the FBS is bringing in less high school players. FBS teams, they're allocating, if they have 15 scholarships available, maybe 5 of those scholarships are going to transfer guys. Well, that's 5 more, scholarships per team that they would otherwise go to 3-star recruits. those recruits aren't getting as many FBS offers. Now they're going to the FCS. And so I think the transfer portal has helped the FCS in terms of getting, higher end recruits. But on the flip side of that, sometimes those recruits end up going to the FBS anyway because of the transfer portal. And so there's positives and negatives to it. I just think, kind of is what it is now. And if you don't adjust to it as a Division I college football coach, and it is what it is now. And so you have to embrace it, because if you think it's the worst thing in the world and you don't embrace it at all, like you're going to lose players to it. And, you can't lose 4 juniors to the transfer portal and replace them with 4 true freshmen out of high school. Unless you have really good depth, you can, but sometimes you need to bring in a sophomore linebacker to replace your linebacker you just lost. And so you just kind of have to embrace it. And, overall, I don't dislike the transfer portal. I think there needs to be more walls or barriers put up to kind of prevent it from getting so crazy. And I think there needs to be more awareness on the player side of it of, this percentage of scholarship players don't end up getting the scholarship after they transfer. Like that sort of awareness, I think needs to be improved. But overall, I think the ability for players to have more freedom overall is good, but there's, obviously there's positives and negatives with everything.
And then again, too, for guys that come down from the FBS to the FCS too. You look at the history of this happening at UNI. You got Theo Day and Desmond Hudson coming back on the team this year, and Day was, like I said, phenomenal this season. And then you go back, Benny Sapp, Woo Governor, Antoine Frazier, Dom Williams, Quan Hampton. So there's talent coming to the FCS, not just going from the FCS to the FBS too.
Yep, and there were I think there was like 180 to 200-ish FCS players that went to the FBS last offseason, which obviously seems like a lot, but there's also more than 500 FBS players going to the FCS. And so there's, 2.5 times more FBS players coming down than FCS players moving up. Now, that's not always an even trade. If you lose your All-American middle linebacker and you bring in 2 FBS transfers at linebacker, that's not always an even trade or whatever. But there is a lot of, FBS guys that come down and make an impact. And I think, when people transfer, a lot of people automatically think of something negative or, bad character, or he pouted because he wasn't getting enough playing time. Sometimes these FBS guys that play at Power 5 schools, they see the writing on the wall and they say, I'm just not going to crack the 2 deep. Yeah, I could try to tough it out and try to crack the 2 deep, but I also see the writing on the wall. I love my players, or I love my teammates, I love my coaches, but my last 2 years of college football, I just want to get on the field somewhere, and I'm going to transfer. If that means going to Northern Iowa or Montana or whatever, then that's better than sitting on the bench at Minnesota. And that's a perfectly fine mindset to have. You're not quitting on your team, as long as you don't leave things on fire and cuss out your coaches for not playing you. Like that stuff doesn't happen as much as people think. For the most part, it's, hey, I want to play somewhere. It's not going to happen here. I'm going to transfer somewhere else. And a lot of times that is FBS guys going to the FCS and making an impact. There's a lot of FBS guys that transferred to the FCS that made huge impacts for their team. Incarnate Word's one. They like 3 of their best players were all transfers. If they didn't have those transfers, they probably lose in the first round and they're not a seed. So, another benefit there too.
With all of that said, I know you're going to start looking more into the portal in January. Any major commitments that have maybe surprised you that you think are going to affect the outlook of the FCS next season that really stick out? Only 3 commitments so far for UNI. I know there's another one coming, which I'm not going to spoil. But any big ones that you've seen so far that maybe surprised you or that you think are going to affect the outlook of the FCS next season?
Yeah, there's a few, and it's harder. When I look, there's going to be a lot of FBS to FCS transfers. That's a little tougher for me because most of the time when I see, all right, this FBS guy is going to the FCS, I don't really know a whole lot about that FBS guy just because I cover the FCS. I don't really pay too much attention to the FBS, and so it's hard for me to say this FBS guy is going to make a huge impact for the FCS. But on the flip side, there's a lot of big name FCS guys that have moved on. McAllen Castles, UC Davis tight end. I think he's going to Tennessee. Cameron Scatabo, the really good running back from Sac State. That's the big one. Had he come back, I thought Sac State would be really good. Losing him is going to be tough for them. He's going to Arizona State. FCS to FCS. Trying to think speaking of Sac State, Carson Camp, who started a lot of games at South Dakota, he committed to Sac State. Sac State is in search of a new starting quarterback, so that could be another big one. So I think those are the few off the top of my head that come to mind that could be impactful transfers.
I don't know about you. Obviously, having covered the MVFC, seeing Carson Camp commit to Sac State, I was like, what? I did not see that one coming at all.
Yeah, I think he's from the Midwest somewhere too. So it's not like he's a California guy heading back to California. So, probably just saw an opportunity where, they're looking for a new starter. They run a fun offense. And, I always thought he was a good player. Like his arm talent is really good. He's got a cannon of an arm. Sometimes he trusts that strength too much and throws it into, dangerous situations. But you probably saw that as a situation where he can step in there and be the day one starter.
He is Sam Herder at Sam Herder FCS on Twitter. You want to get a grand landscape view of the FCS, you got to go give him a follow there. He does great work covering the whole country. Sam, we appreciate you hopping on, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having me.
And that'll do it for this week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk. Thanks so much for tuning in today here on AM 950, KOEL, and KOEL.com with me, Eliot Clough, UNI insider for Town Square Media. Before you go, make sure that you subscribe or follow, depending on where you're listening to this podcast, so you don't miss any episodes. We don't want that to happen. And of course, be sure to leave that rate and review on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on YouTube, and do all that for us. It does help us out a lot. So once again, folks, my name is Eliot Clough at Eliot Clough on Twitter. I'm a UNI insider for Town Square Media. This was another week's episode of Corn Stalks and Sports Talk.